When I fall in love, I get dizzy. I fall out there just down.
This is Historical Hotties, a podcast where we go through different categories of historical figure and try and figure out which one is the biggest babe.
Still.
Welcome to Historical Hotties, the show where we rifle through the annals of history to pull out its most swoon-worthy occupants. I'm Lindsey Nelson, and joining me, as always, is the woman who's listed in my contacts as Shadow Boss,
Whitney Nelson.
Today, our category of hottie that we're discussing is famous recluses. Whitney, tell us about your hottie.
Alright, so for my hottie, I chose Emily Dickinson, who is one of the more famous recluses there is. Emily Dickinson was born in 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts. Her father was a prominent lawyer and businessman, later a representative in Congress. She had a couple of siblings, a brother and a sister. They were the family as a whole were very firm believers in education for women as well as men, which was not necessarily common at the time. Emily Dickinson's grandfather actually helped to found Amherst College. She went to Amherst Academy, and then later she went to Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. She had been described as a youth, as shy, demure, and neatly dressed. She really liked flowers. She was often wearing or carrying them as part of her fashion, even though she wasn't a particularly fashionable person, and she spent quite a bit of time in her life gardening. She's still known for that to this day. For reasons that are kind of unknown as far as history goes, she left the Holyoke Female Seminary after only 1 year, and that was about the time that she began kind of restricting her social interaction to only members of her own family. The town of Amherst at the time was a pretty small town. It was very influenced by the college that her grandfather started, but also there was a railroad nearby, and then religion was a big thing in Amherst. She was actually pretty strong in her religious feelings, but also in expressing doubts and being skeptical and asking questions, and being pretty strong in that a personal way of seeing religion is a fine way to see religion. You don't have to feel the way that people tell you you have to feel, and it's also, you can be strongly religious while expressing doubts and being skeptical and asking questions, which I think is a really strong quality just kind of about anything. Any way that you're like, I can believe a thing, but ask questions about it, and that doesn't make my belief any less strong, is an impressive thing. Almost none of her writing, she was a poet for those of you that don't know, very little of her writing was actually published while she was alive. Most of her poems when she was alive, there was only about 12 or so, they were published anonymously, and several of them without her permission. She did not know they were being published. Personality-wise, she enjoyed wordplay and riddles, which is kind of fitting since she herself in history is kind of a riddle and not much is known about her. She was very witty while she was still shy and reserved. She's kind of been left open to a lot of speculation and turned into a little bit of a myth because so little is known about her life. There's only one existing photograph of her, and it was taken when she was 17 years old. In her lifetime, she has created over 1,700 poems. They didn't seem to have any apparent pattern or progression. Several have no titles or dates. And actually, it was really when she began to withdraw from public life and become sort of reclusive in ways that neighbors noticed and acquaintances noticed. That was actually when she started producing content in general. She had written before when she was in school and when she was a little bit more sociable, but when she started sort of withdrawing to her rooms. So around 1867 is when she really began to withdraw from public life in ways that her family and her friends and neighbors couldn't help but start to notice. She would only talk to callers through the front door instead of face-to-face when they would come around. When she would have company that would come over, she often would retire to her room when they would come to call, and to not be rude because she still enjoyed taking care of people and being friendly to them even if she didn't want to be around them. She would leave gifts or set out full spreads of food for them to enjoy, but she would not see them when they would come. She loved to treat the neighborhood children, but would put little candy and treats into a basket from her second-story bedroom window and would lower the basket down for the children to, like, grab treats out of. And she would almost never show her face. All the recollections of Emily Dickinson, it was always just her arms lowering down a basket full of goodies for any children that were nearby. She did spend time with her family still, the close family. She did love to lavish attention on children like nieces and nephews that she was around. She just really preferred to be alone. She started very eccentrically starting to dress exclusively in white dresses that she had sewn herself, which became like a really big talking point about mental health and pulling the recluse factor into an area that I don't necessarily think it deserves. She is a mysterious person who definitely preferred her own company, but I don't think that she had agoraphobia. I don't think that she had mental illness, because she did have friendships. She would spend time with family. She would lavish attention and play with nieces and nephews. She continued several mentee-mentor relationships with people that she found to be intellectually stimulating or that she felt that she could get something from. She even, in her very late life, had a romantic affair through writing exclusively with Massachusetts Supreme Court Judge Otis Phillips Lord. So she had romantic ideas. She just really listened to herself and cared more about what she was hearing from within when it was quiet and she was alone than what she was getting from the outside. But it was the white dresses that she sewed herself that kind of made everyone around her start to think that she was crazy.
Added to the ghostly, haunted woman in the tower reputation that she was starting to get in the town. Yeah.
Absolutely.
You know, you keep picking people off my short lists in these categories, which I think gives you an unfair advantage when it comes to rating later on.
I will say that I do have a tendency to go for maybe not the most common pick, but maybe sort of like the favorites. I've noticed that myself. Rather than finding someone obscure that maybe people don't know about, maybe learning something new about somebody myself, if I already know when we talk about a topic, if I know who I want it to be, I don't branch out from that. And I do think that maybe, not intentionally, but I think it might give me an edge. I think you're right, because I'm pulling people that I know that not just I like, but sort of people in general like, and also you like, which may influence the scoring a little bit, but I do promise it's unintentional.
Oh, I don't think you're trying to do it. I just think, I know that we also find the same kind of people intriguing, so it makes sense we have, like, similar short lists in these categories.
I'm never, like, trying to think, who can I pick that Lindsey will like, and it will make me win with my hottie? I don't do that.
Well, it's good to know you're not sitting doing the Mr. Burns fingers before
it's just when I have a favorite that I know is a favorite, I have to pick that rather than trying to go for someone more obscure. Like,
right, and this is supposed to be who we find appealing and hot and attractive. It's not supposed to be who's the most obscure or weirdest person I can pick in this category. And hot people kind of are remembered for being hot people, so...
Okay, so Lindsey, who's your pick?
So my pick is the divine woman, the Swedish Sphinx, Greta Garbo. So Greta Garbo, picked as one of the top 5 female film actresses of all time, is a silent era film star. She did transition into talkies, but she started in the silent film era. She was born in September of 1905 in Stockholm, Sweden, and she was born Greta Gustafsson, and she was interested in theater. She was a very daydreamy, imaginative child, and she was interested in theater from a very young age, so much so that the high school she went to was the Royal Academy for Dramatic Arts in Stockholm. But her father died when she was 14, and she had to start working, and so she started working in this department store in the millinery department, and very quickly started modeling hats and stuff for the store's catalog, and that transitioned her into some commercial work and some local Swedish films. She was kind of found by this director who she became a muse for, and she was cast in this sort of historical epic that was shown to Louis B. Mayer of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. MGM. And he was immediately captivated by her. She wasn't a big part in it, but he just found her eyes so magnetic and thought that she had a lot of potential, so paid to bring her over to the States to do some screen tests and ended up signing a contract with MGM. But nobody really knew what to do with her. She was very different from any of their starlets at the time. They'd gone for these very petite, delicate, and she was this tall, boyish, athletic Scandinavian. Very different. She had this big frizzy hair and wore all these boyish, sporty clothes, and they didn't really know what to do with her. And so they kind of, at the time, the studio system was very big on, like, we have to give this star an image and make all their roles fit into that, and all of their publicity appearances fit into this character that we give them. And because nobody could really figure Garbo out, and she didn't speak English for the first year, so it was hard for the press to talk to her, they decided on this elusive, unknowable sphinx sort of persona. And then when she started to learn English, they really doubled down on that because she was way too frank in interviews for their taste. When asked if she'd ever been married when she was 19 by a reporter, she said no, but Max and I had lived together for 2 years.
Scandal.
And so MGM was like, nope, you're not allowed to talk to the press anymore. Which was actually kind of a relief for Garbo because she didn't like being a part of the sort of Hollywood social scene. She didn't like going to the premieres and doing all that kind of stuff. So she kind of embraced the recluse role. What made Garbo really stand out when she started getting parts in films at MGM was that she had such an incredibly expressive face, and she was performing with this subtlety that had been unknown in film kind of until her. She was one of the real first film actresses. Everybody else had come from theater and was doing these very big, exaggerated, heightened performances, and hers was this subtle play in her eyes and her face, and she could speak volumes with all of that, and that's what sort of really made her famous. Also, she was known for being erotically charged in a way that other actresses would, probably because she could be so expressive in such subtle ways, and especially with her first co-star, who she ended up having a several-year romantic relationship with, John Gilbert. They had this chemistry on film that people talked about, that them just looking at each other or not looking at each other or walking past each other, almost touching, made the camera people blush and like turn off the cameras because they could convey such sexual energy and tension in what seemed like nothing happening on the screen. It was her first couple of films with John Gilbert are really what made her a star. They were very worried in the 30s when talkies came in because of her Swedish accent. They were very worried about her translating and people not liking her voice. So they built up the fact that she didn't give interviews, she was reclusive, she didn't talk, to market the film as Garbo Speaks. Was on the bottom of all of the posters and everything. And then in the first line in the movie, she had this sultry, accented voice that was surprisingly deep, and everybody just totally loved it. It kicked her stardom up another level to what was called Garbomania, with the release of probably her two most popular and famous and highest grossing films, which came out in the same year, which was The Grand Hotel and Mata Hari. In The Grand Hotel, she utters the line that was kind of associated as her catchphrase, but she'd never actually said in a film before, which was, "I want to be alone." And she says it about 15 times in 3 minutes in one scene. Nobody's quite sure how much of Garbo's reclusive, mysterious, unknowable persona was the studio and was her. What is definitely for sure is she didn't like being a part of the Hollywood social scene. She preferred doing stuff with close friends. She didn't like a lot of big public, large crowds. She also had rules on set that were unheard of before her time and stuff. Like, she liked as few people on set as possible, even to the point where she'd have them put up black flats, screens around her, so that nobody could see her act, because she said, when I was alone, I can get my face to do things that it won't do otherwise. So there is definitely some truth and some artifice to her mysterious, reclusive image, and nobody's quite sure where the line is. Nobody quite being sure what's true and what's not about Garbo has been, for a long time, part of her allure. There was lots of rumors about her being bisexual. While she had several notable relationships with men, she also had several notable relationships that were talked about with women. Louisa Brooks, another silent film star known as The Flapper, who shared an MGM house with her, has talked about that they had a relationship. And
Marlene Dietrich.
Marlene Dietrich has talked about it, and Lillian Tashman, all actresses at the time who claimed to have had something going on with Garbo, and Mercedes de Acosta, who I got to tell you is a woman who deserves her own podcast episode because she was a notorious Spanish socialite, stylish lesbian about town who was noted for seducing famous women. After she pretty much seduced all of the leading ladies on Broadway, she went to Hollywood with the express purpose of falling in love with Garbo. And they were together for on and off for about 2 years.
I've never heard of this woman, and now I need to know everything about this woman.
I felt the exact same way in doing research into Garbo. I found out about her, and I was like, now all I want to do is read stuff about Mercedes de Acosta. And, you know, not only was part of Garbo's appeal this unaccessibility of her, that in a lot of her part, she was she was always in love, but she was usually never as in love as the man. There was an unreachable quality about her. And that she was so eccentric and strange, nobody could ever figure out what was really going on in her head. She would do things like one time in a visit to Sweden, this is when you still had to take boats across the Atlantic, and she would never dine in the dining room with anybody else, but she didn't take them in her room. She had them served to her on deck every night, eating them in a different lifeboat. In her later life, when she was kind of a reclusive hermit in New York, a friend came over and visited her one time, and they were having drinks and peanuts, and he dropped a peanut and he went down to pick it up, and he saw that under her couch was an army of like the little 80s troll dolls they were like all in the middle of a scene. And then next time he came and visited her a couple weeks later, he looked under the couch again and they were all still there, but they were all in different positions.
Oh no.
So there was some ongoing drama.
I was all in for Greta Garbo until you said that little snippet, and now I'm all out.
You don't like that she was playing with trolls under her couch in her living room?
No!
Anyways, there's been lots of speculation about what was real and what was artifice with Garbo, but she has remained one of the most enigmatic and magnetic personas in Hollywood to this day.
All right.
So, now it's time for us to move into some of our categories, which are physical attractiveness, mental attractiveness, social impact, and je ne sais quoi. So, why don't you talk about Emily Dickinson's mental attractiveness?
Where do you even start? Being that so little is known about her life and so few people got to know her as a person in person, all we know about her is what she put into her writing. And her writing is incredible. Compared to poets of the time, when you're talking, in the 1860s or so, she's very casual. She's very modern even still to this day in her structure and the sort of language that she uses. She just really spent so much time deeply feeling what she deeply felt and finding ways to put that into words. She wrote thousands of poems, like we talked about earlier. Joyce Carol Oates, who's a novelist, once said, in her astonishing body of 1,775 poems, Dickinson records what is surely one of the most meticulous examinations of the phenomenon of human consciousness ever undertaken. She might not have known much of the outside world, but she knew herself completely. And I think that kind of sums it all up. As far as mental attractiveness goes, I don't really think it gets much better than Emily Dickinson. I give her 5. That's all I have to say.
Obviously we've already talked about it. She was on my short list for this category. And I think the way that she talks about there's a couple ongoing themes in her poem about passion, and that she felt strongly that passion was a very humanistic quality, and the way that she thought that sort of seeing and understanding was related to existence and living, that like as soon as you couldn't see, you died, and that to really see something was to really feel it and understand it. And so much passion in all of the stuff that she wrote. She found inspiration and drive in the smallest things, like a bee in her garden would be this whole drama of human existence, passion of life. And that is the thing I think is interesting about the white dress, is that for Emily Dickinson, white was the color of passion. In all of her poems, passion is white hot. It's not red or anything like that. So that whole, very misinterpreted by her neighbors, of her being wan, white-clad figure in her house, was that she was getting like more passionately intense as her life went on. So yes, I mean, obviously, I think she's a 5 in mental attractiveness.
Yeah. And Greta Garbo, mental attractiveness.
So one of the really intriguing things about Garbo, like I talked about, is the way that nobody could really figure her out. Is she brilliant? is she just have nothing to say? Is she, like, uneducated and stupid, or is she brilliant in thinking all these deep thoughts? We don't know. Is she essentially normal and good at performing, or is she, in her bones, this kind of odd, outside of normal human behavior kind of creature? So her unknowableness being part of her main attractive about her, it's hard to know, but I do think it's intriguing either way, that either she was just this unique person who didn't care at all about social conventions. And one of the things I really liked when the rumors of her bisexuality started really circulating in the Hollywood tabloid press, she intentionally set out to do a movie called Queen Christina, in which the queen character was bisexual, dressed as a man sometimes, and had affairs with women, but was also married and passionately in love with the king. So her response to people talking about her being bisexual was, here's a big bisexual movie for the 30s. Like, I like that she definitely seemed to feel confident in herself, whatever that self actually was. And I find that very attractive. So I would give her a 4.
Totally.
Out of 5.
Totally. Yep, me too. Me too, 4 out of 5. Okay, physical attractiveness. Emily Dickinson. There's only one photograph of her and she's 17. She is very pretty, very fair, but dark hair. But, you know, she hasn't gone down in history as like an ethereal beauty or anything like that. She has a very long neck. She's got very delicate sort of features. And she definitely has a moodiness and a soulfulness in her eyes that is captured by that one picture when she was 17 alone. She definitely is attractive. I don't feel like she's, you know, real smoke show.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna vote 3. I think she's definitely on the pretty end of average.
That's exactly how I feel about her. What is so compelling about Emily Dickinson, like we just talked about, is her sort of inner, like, I'd say a 3 as well.
Yeah. We don't even need to talk about Greta Garbo.
No, but can we for just a second?
I mean, like, we all know she's 5s across the board from everybody because she's Greta freaking Garbo.
I mean, she's so luminous, and she's all lithe and languid, and just the straightest nose in recorded human history. If you've ever just really looked at Greta Garbo's nose, it's kind of amazing.
That's a weird thing to say.
So yes, Greta Garbo.
I mean, I'm not arguing. But
it's inhumanly perfect. It's just like, it looks like it was drawn with a straight ruler. I've never seen a nose like that. So, anyways, but she was so luminous and expressive, and her eyes were so magnetic, and she was just a screen goddess for a reason. So, I would definitely say a 5.
Yeah.
As you've already acknowledged, a 5.
Yeah. So for social impact, I feel like these two people are kind of a good example of the issue we keep running into when we say social impact, which is, do we mean lasting impact on the culture? Do we mean huge amount of pop culture impact? And, you know, like, it's just hard when we talk about social impact to truly define what that means. And here we have Greta Garbo, who is cinema and gossip columns and relationships and fads of fashion and just being a trendy it girl type person, which is a huge amount of social impact. Having Garbo fever was a thing, and so, like, that's an incredible amount of social impact. But in the long term, Emily Dickinson's writing, her attitudes, they were sort of quietly revolutionary at the time, and they definitely changed poetry and writing to some extent, or influenced them in some way. And I feel like it's a very different level of social impact, but I feel like it's hard to measure those two things against each other. I think for me, my personal vote is a 5 for Emily Dickinson and a 4 for Greta Garbo. I think they're both very influential in their own ways. I don't know that either of them changed the entire world, so this is sort of in their own realms that we're talking about. It's not like social impact for the next 300 years. The world will be different because of either of them. Yeah. But I do think the world is different because of both of them in different ways. So that's my vote. 5 for Emily Dickinson, 4 for Greta Garbo.
We're just in so much agreement on this podcast. I think Emily Dickinson's impact was after her life and continued to grow. She really changed how people thought of poetry structure and, her use of like dashes and slant rhyme, and really sort of expanded what people thought they could do with that literary format. And Garbo had a huge impact in her lifetime with her insane popularity and impact on style, and pushed forward film acting as like its own kind of acting with a different subtlety and complexity. But hers was while she was alive more than I think like altering stuff into the future. So I agree with your ratings for both of them as far as social impact.
Okay, and what do you rate for Je ne sais quoi?
I think Garbo and Je ne sais quoi are sort of like synonymous, because nobody could quite figure out what they found so compelling about her. She couldn't be caught, and she couldn't be tied down, and she couldn't be really truly had, and that was part of what, she left John Gilbert at the altar 3 times, but he still asked her to marry him again after she kept running out of windows and stuff at their weddings, because while she acknowledged that he was probably the great love of her life, she couldn't resign herself to ever being owned by somebody. That sacrifice of freedom, and I think Garbo kind of is je ne sais quoi, and that not even she really understood herself, and nobody could quite decide why they found her so compelling. So I would say she's a 5 in je ne sais quoi.
Okay, I would agree with that. I think that's fair. I think that not knowing what it is about her is like her whole thing, and that's what je ne sais quoi means. I think that for Emily Dickinson, a great example of this, just a little microcosm, is she had a 8-year correspondence with a friend, an acquaintance. It had been only correspondence. They had never met in person. And the first time that she and this person met, here's the quote of their meeting. "After a little delay, I heard an extremely faint and pattering footstep like that of a child in the hall. She came towards me with 2 daylilies, which she put in a childlike way into my hand, saying softly under her breath, 'These are my introduction.' And then she added, also under her breath, 'Forgive me if I am frightened. I never see strangers and hardly know what I say.' When she started talking, however, Dickinson wouldn't shut up." And this person meeting her for the first time just sort of sat in silence as Dickinson talked nonstop. She seemed to speak, this is now quote again, "She seemed to speak absolutely for her own relief, and wholly without watching its effect on the hearer. She was much too enigmatical a being for me to solve in an hour's interview. An instinct told me that the slightest attempt at direct cross-examination would make her withdraw into her shell. I could only sit still and watch, as one does in the woods." And I think that's another great example, in a very different way, of je ne sais quoi. I think that being able to fully know a person, but being so drawn to them anyway, is kind of the essence of it. And, obviously in Emily Dickinson it presents in a very different way, but I think that she is also a 5. She is brilliant and enigmatic and has all of that in just a very different way than Greta Garbo, but I think equal to. So I vote 5.
Yeah, I can see. I mean, she is very compelling, and the very idea of her and trying to understand her has occupied people ever since her death. So, yeah, I would give her a 5.
All right, so we have agreed with everything entirely. I
know, we're in such accord this episode.
I apologize to anyone who is listening to hear sisters argue with one another.
Yeah, listen to Glam Rock if you want to hear us fight.
Okay, so I have the totals, and the winner is... It's a tie. It is a complete tie between Greta Garbo and Emily Dickinson. Mm-hmm.
Oh, really? I mean, we did kind of go back and forth in different categories with, they're both alluring and mysterious reclusive figures that are sort of hallmarks of what that means. So...
Yep. So we have a tie between Emily Dickinson and Greta Garbo. Thanks for listening. If you guys have any suggestions for future hottie categories, or you disagree with our rankings on this category, or you have stories you want to tell us about Mercedes de Acosta, you can reach out to us on Twitter at historicallyhot. We also have a website at historicallyhot.com. You can check out past episodes and contact us that way if you want to add any feedback or give us some suggestions of what we should do in the future. Thanks for listening.
Stay hot, everybody.